For more than 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident has been one of history's greatest and most chilling unsolved mysteries. We're talking about 9 experienced hikers found dead, a scene of just baffling horror, and a puzzle that led to theories about everything from Yetis and secret Soviet weapons to, you guessed it, aliens. But now, it really looks like modern science, using some very unlikely tools, may have finally pieced together the tragic truth. So let's dive in and see how they cracked it. It all starts with this image. When searchers finally reached the abandoned camp high in Russia's Ural Mountains, this is what they found. The team's tent, half buried in snow. But the truly terrifying part, it had been sliced open from the inside. The people who were in there, all of them expert mountaineers, had fled in a blind panic out into the brutal sub-zero wilderness. Some were wearing only socks, and some were completely barefoot.
So to really appreciate how science finally solved this case, we have to first understand the mystery itself and exactly why it stayed unsolved for so long.
Okay, let's get the basic facts down. In late January of 1959, 10 hikers set out on this really ambitious trip, but one of them turned back early, a decision that, without a doubt, saved his life. The remaining 9, led by Igor Dyatlov, made their final camp on February 1st, and they made it on a slope known ominously by the local Mansi people as Dead Mountain. They were never seen alive again. And when searchers finally got there weeks later, that's when the true horror really began to unfold. What they found was just a complete nightmare. Bodies were scattered all over the slope, some nearly a mile from the tent. A few had suffered these catastrophic injuries. We're talking crushed ribs, fractured skulls, the kind of trauma you'd normally see in a high-speed car crash. But here's the crazy part. On the outside, there were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises. Meanwhile, others had just frozen to death, but they were found in this strange state of undress. The official Soviet investigation? They were totally stumped. Their final conclusion was that the hikers had been killed by a compelling, unknown natural force. Now that is so incredibly vague, right? That finding, plus the classic secrecy of the Soviet Union, meant the case was just shut tight. It created this vacuum that was immediately filled by 6 straight decades of wild, and I mean wild, speculation. Now, the most logical explanation here should have been a simple one, an avalanche. I mean, it makes sense. But for over 60 years, investigators, experts, everyone insisted that just wasn't possible. The question is, why? This right here is the heart of the mystery. These are all the reasons the avalanche theory just didn't add up. For starters, the slope just didn't look steep enough to cause a serious slide. And weather records? They show no heavy snowfall that night to even trigger one. The injuries were also all wrong. Avalanche victims usually suffocate. They don't get their chests caved in without a single cut on their skin. But the real nail in the coffin for the theory was the timing. There was this baffling 9-hour gap between the team setting up camp and whatever happened. An avalanche should be instant. This wasn't. So, if a normal avalanche was off the table, what other force could have possibly done this? This is where the story takes a turn, and modern science steps into the picture with some truly unexpected clues. It turns out, the key to unlocking this whole 60-year-old mystery wasn't hiding in some old, dusty Soviet case file. Nope, it was found in 2 very, very unlikely places: Hollywood animation and 1970s car crash tests. Yeah, you heard me right. Okay, so fast forward to 2021. 2 Swiss scientists, Alexander Prizren and Johann Gaumu, decide they're going to tackle this cold case. Now, these guys aren't detectives. They're engineers who are experts in snow mechanics and avalanches. Their whole goal was to use computer simulations to see if they could actually recreate the conditions of that fatal night and find a scientific explanation that finally fit all the bizarre pieces of evidence. And this is where the story gets absolutely wild. To build their computer model, they turned to 2 incredibly strange sources. For the snow physics, they actually adapted animation code that was used to make Disney's movie Frozen. Yes, that Frozen. And to understand the hikers' injuries, they dug up old data from 1970s General Motors experiments, where they crash-tested human cadavers to improve car safety. One of the researchers, Johann Gaum, was so blown away by how realistic the snow looked in Frozen that he literally went to Hollywood to talk to the animators to see how they did it. He then took their code, modified it, and turned what was movie magic into a seriously powerful scientific tool, one that could simulate not just any avalanche, but the precise impact a specific slab of snow would have on a human body. That old GM data was the other crucial piece of the puzzle, and here's why it was so perfect. The hikers had laid their skis on the floor of the tent to insulate themselves from the freezing ground. That means they were sleeping on a hard, rigid base. Well, in some of those old GM tests, the cadavers were also braced against rigid supports, making that data a shockingly perfect match for modeling the kind of brutal, specific force that could break ribs and skulls without ever piercing the skin.
And this illustrates the beginning of the end. This is the last photograph ever taken by the Dyatlov team. You can see them cutting a ledge into the snowpack to shelter their tent from the wind. Now, that's a totally standard thing for mountaineers to do, but they had no way of knowing that this one simple act had just critically weakened the huge slab of snow resting right above them.
So what about that mysterious 9-hour delay? The answer seems to be something called katabatic winds. Just think of these as strong, frigid winds that act like a conveyor belt, carrying tons of heavy snow down a mountainside. For more than 9 hours that night, these winds were just steadily piling feet of extra snow right on top of that weakened slab above the tent. Slowly and invisibly, they were loading the spring on a deadly trap. And what about that whole argument that the slope was too mild? Well, that was an illusion. The rolling terrain buried under all that snow made the slope look really gentle. But the researchers' analysis of the actual topography showed that the incline right where they camped was actually 30 degrees, which is the exact minimum angle you need for a slab avalanche to happen.
So, with all these pieces finally in place, the frozen code, the car crash data, the weakened slope, and those katabatic winds, the scientists could at last reconstruct what most likely happened moment by tragic moment.
Okay, so here is the final story. Sometime in the middle of the night, that overloaded slab of snow finally broke. A block of snow about 16 feet long, roughly the size of an SUV, slammed down onto one section of the tent. It wasn't a massive, sweeping avalanche, just a small but brutally dense and heavy slab. The impact caused those horrific internal injuries, but it wasn't immediately fatal. In the dark and the chaos, the survivors cut their way out, dragging their injured friends with them, absolutely desperate to escape a second avalanche they thought was coming. But in fleeing that phantom danger, they ran straight into a much deadlier one, the lethal cold.
And this is just so important to understand. For years, people have claimed the hikers were foolish or took unnecessary risks. But this study shows the complete opposite. These were highly competent, expert mountaineers who were just caught in an incredibly rare and unforeseeable event. One of the researchers, Alexander Puzrin, says this kind of freak avalanche would have surprised even the most experienced pros. They were simply in the wrong place at the absolute worst time.
In the end, the science reveals a profoundly human story. The fact that all 9 bodies were found outside the tent strongly suggests the uninjured members didn't just abandon their friends. They fought to save them, pulling them from the crushed tent. As Polzrin says, when you look at the evidence, this is a story of courage and friendship in the face of an absolutely impossible situation.
So the science gives us a logical, compelling, and deeply tragic answer to the Dyatlov Pass enigma. It honors the victims by revealing not recklessness, but incredible courage. And yet, it does leave us with one final question. As one researcher pointed out, some people will never accept the answer is an avalanche because, as he put it, it's too normal. And that really makes you wonder, is a logical explanation, no matter how elegant, ever quite as powerful as a great unsolved mystery?